I assume that you know, and I mentioned it last night, that this conference is in collaboration with the Baha'i international community at the United Nations, which is headed by Miss Bani Dugal, who I'm going to introduce to you now. I have to say she's a good friend, and I've known her for many years, and I have learned so much from her. She's world-traveled, sort of like an ambassador, and she's a defender of people, especially oppressed people. And so what she does is really admirable, because as you can imagine, it's not easy to do this kind of work day after day after day. So I say that because really the chair is honored to have collaborated with her office. Thank you. Ms. Bani Dugal is the principal representative of the Baha'i international community at the United Nations. As a part of the community of international NGOs at the United Nations since 1994, she is currently a member of the steering group of the NGO Working Group on the Security Council. Previously, she served as president of the NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief and co-facilitator of the NGO Working Group on UN Access, among other committees. She holds a master's degree in environmental law and a law degree from the University of Delhi in India. Prior to relocating to the United States in 1988, she practiced law before the Supreme Court in India. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Ms. Bani Dugal.
Good afternoon, everyone. The question we are concerned with at this time is one that speaks to the highest aspirations of most, if not all, the peoples of the world. The question of the establishment of peace. It's a perennial question that has occupied the minds of people throughout the centuries, but during our time, this question assumes new characteristics. First, we are concerned with peace at a global level. Through our hard-earned lessons, we knew that we were never immune from conflicts happening outside the borders of our countries or regions. Second, we know that peace is not the mere absence of war. We know that beliefs, attitudes, and habits of thought, sense of identity, the relationships we foster, and the social structures within which we live are an integral part of peace. The 20th century offers us many lessons about the processes of social change, the ways in which peoples and nations strive for a more just society, a society with effective governing institutions, fair-minded leaders, full employment, equal opportunity for women and men, education and healthcare for all, to name but a few. In the absence of these conditions, the world has witnessed a full spectrum of responses, from populations responding to conditions of injustice. We can look to recent history, to the waves of protests and riots that spread across the Arab world, known as the Arab Spring, the violent clashes between populations fleeing war in Syria and with the Hungarian border guards, rebel groups in Uganda and DRC, racial tensions and conflicts sweeping the United States, Iran's Green Movement, Gandhi's Salt March, student protests in Tiananmen Square. We also see examples of courage and forgiveness with Ugandan mothers whose children had been kidnapped and abducted by rebels, and their forgiveness towards those rebels. So responses to injustice have ranged from violence and revenge to struggles for change, which eschew violent means. So when we think about the creation of a peaceful society of overcoming conditions of oppression, we can think of the various actors, protagonists in such an enterprise, and the kinds of responsibilities that society assigns to them. At the UN, for example, it's the member states that hold primary responsibility for the protection of populations and upholding international law. It is true that they bear a special responsibility, yet they're not the only actors. We learned this morning from Anne-Marie's presentation that we have citizen action. Women's groups around the world are doing things to change their lives. The actions of ordinary individuals is equally important. Individuals who dare to speak out against injustice, which demonstrates solidarity with those at risk. Individuals who inspire and demonstrate what is possible. This is particularly important when we consider scenarios where it is the government itself that is committing crimes against its people. In such situations, a different configuration of responsibility is needed, and the international community has put in place the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which provides measures for the international community to come to the aid of persecuted nations and peoples. In my remarks, I'd like to look at different scenarios which offer insights into the processes of social change. And this, after all, goes to the heart of what we are talking about. We all want peace. How do we move society in that direction, in the direction of peace? What lessons can we learn from our experience? I'd like to share 3 brief examples of citizen action for social change, and then consider the approach practiced by members of the Iranian Baha'i community in their response to the persistent and institutionalized oppression that they've faced in their native country of Iran. The first example I'd like to share is that of Albania during the Second World War. From this country comes the dramatic story of Albanians who are a people and a nation, who as a people and nation during World War II welcomed and protected Jews from Nazi persecution. They did this despite German occupation and at great risk to those who offered shelter to the Jews. As was related to me by the ambassador of Albania to the United Nations, what makes the Albanian story unique is that every member of the Jewish community living in Albania survived the Holocaust. Like no other occupied country, Albania became a Jewish sanctuary, and it had 10 times more Jews within its border at the end of the war than it had at the beginning. A second story is that of Jacqueline Murakatete, a human rights activist and survivor of the Rwandan genocide. In a discussion last year at the UN, she shared the story of how, with the help of 2 courageous Italian priests at St. Anthony's Orphanage in Nyanza, Rwanda, she survived the 1994 genocide. She was the only one of her family to survive, and the genocide claimed the lives of her parents and all her siblings and cousins and many other extended members of her family. She tells the story of the Italian priests who suffered physical abuse for their acts, who were called by their embassy, the Italian embassy in Rwanda, multiple times and told that they could choose to be evacuated. And each time they refused. They told the embassy that they would only leave if they could take all the children with them. And so over 300 Tutsi children survived. When we think of examples of courageous actions, one type often overlooked is when the members of a dominant majority breaks ranks and speaks out on behalf of an oppressed minority. This precisely describes the actions of Iranian cleric Ayatollah Abdul Hamid Masumi Tehrani. In the face of persistent and cruel persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, Ayatollah Tehrani publicly gifted to the Baha'is of the world an illuminated work of calligraphy, highlighting a passage from the writings of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith. And I'll cite a portion of the passage he chose to illuminate. Consort with all religions with unity and concord, that they may inhale from you the sweet fragrance of God. I share these stories to demonstrate that these three examples of courageous, principled, and humanitarian action, stories that remind us of the strength of human character and the tremendous role of the individual in demonstrating peace-building responses in conditions of extreme trials. I'll focus the remainder of my presentation. I work on persecution all the time. I will focus for the remainder of my presentation on the examples of an approach to social change pursued by the Baha'i community of Iran while facing conditions of violent oppression. It's a distinctively non-adversarial approach, which I hope can offer new insights into the manner in which social change can be pursued. Insights about the roles of the oppressed and the ultimate purpose of social change. For over 160 years, the Baha'i community in Iran has been a target of recurrent waves of discrimination. Since the early 1980s, over 200 have been executed or murdered. Thousands arrested, detained, interrogated, and tens of thousands deprived of jobs, pensions, and educational opportunities. Thousands more have been forced to leave Iran. The community's holy places, cemeteries, and property have been confiscated, vandalized, or destroyed. And many individuals have lost their homes, and other property has been seized or damaged. Baha'is haven't been the only ones. The increasing persecution of Baha'is comes as part of a wider crackdown on the Iranian population. Iranian journalists, human rights defenders, students, trade unionists, and women are among those who have been imprisoned since 2005. This has all been extensively documented by the United Nations and human rights organizations. The key difference in the persecution of the Baha'is is that despite being Iran's largest non-Muslim religious minority, they are not recognized in the Iranian constitution. As such, they have no legal recourse by means of which they can defend themselves or seek justice. The government itself has explicitly outlined in numerous official documents a policy of oppression that specifically targets Baha'is and systematically seeks to marginalize them in Iranian society. The most significant of these papers, these policies, is a secret 1991 document, which is not so secret anymore. It's known as the Baha'i Question. Brought to light by the UN in 1993, the memorandum, in stark language, lays out the government's overall objective to ensure that Baha'is are treated in such a way that their progress and development is blocked. And that's a direct quote from the memorandum. So how does a community respond to such treatment? To economic marginalization, physical torture, desecration of their cemeteries and holy places, imprisonment, execution, and a persistent campaign of misinformation unleashed by state-sponsored media. How do Baha'is choose among the various possibilities open to them? How are they guided in their decisions? How does their response help us to understand the dynamics of social change and peace? The experience of the Baha'i community in the pursuit of constructive and non-adversarial response to oppression has been complex and multifaceted. It raises an important set of questions for us to consider. How do we conceive of the role of the victims of oppression? Do they have agency? Can we speak of this as a kind of responsibility? What role can victims themselves play in alleviating the ingrained societal prejudices against them? Before turning to these questions, I will examine some of the principles that underlie the Baha'is' choice and consistent expression of a distinctly non-adversarial approach to ongoing persecution at the hands of Iranian authorities. The Baha'i faith, all of its teachings are anchored in the principle of the oneness of humanity. On the surface, it may appear deceptively simple. Yet, the implications of this principle are profound and far-reaching. It has implications for all facets of society, social structures, institutions, processes of governance, relationships, values, and culture, to name a few. The Baha'i faith draws on the analogy of the human body to help to convey the operation of this principle. Within the context of the human body, millions of cells exist in mutualistic relationships, supporting the thriving of the body as a whole, which in turn supports the health and vitality of the individual cells. The relationships of mutualism bind and coordinate the actions of the cells in a manner that gives rise to the coordinated action of the human body. The concept of human interdependence is now one which is more and more widely accepted. Whether we are talking about climate change, the economy, global health, we are continually working to refine governing processes as well as international law in a manner that is better adapted to the conditions of our heightened interdependence. We can consider the example of the Baha'i response to oppression from the perspective of an approach to social change that is adapting to these conditions of heightened interdependence. So how does the international governing body of the worldwide Baha'i community guide the actions of the persecuted Baha'i community? In a letter to the Baha'i community in Iran, in 2009, they wrote, "With an illumined conscience, with a world-embracing vision, with no partisan political agenda, and with due regard for law and order, strive for the regeneration of your country. By your deeds and services, attract the hearts of those around you, even with the esteem of your avowed enemies, so that you may vindicate the innocence of all and gain ever-increasing respect and acceptance for your community in the land of its birth." So what are the elements of this guidance? No partisan political agenda, regard for law and order, strive for the betterment of Iran, gain respect for your community through your deeds and services, work hand in hand with your fellow citizens, work towards the unity of the human race. Note that this approach does not align itself with nonviolent opposition of civil disobedience, nonviolent opposition or civil disobedience. This approach is completely non-adversarial and non-oppositional. In another letter to the Iranian Baha'is, the international governing body of the Baha'i faith has stated, the proper response to oppression is neither to succumb in resignation nor take on the characteristics of the oppressor. So this doesn't mean that Baha'is are forbidden for appealing for justice for themselves and other oppressed minorities through proper legal means. Rather, they are encouraged to use every principled means to defend themselves and others against oppression and to work towards the empowerment of oppressed people everywhere. The pursuit of rights is to be principled, confident, and persistent. Baha'is are encouraged to persevere with sincerity and earnestness to secure your rights with recourse to the law. Of course, some individual Baha'is may fall short of these ideals, but in most of the cases, we see a community engaged in non-adversarial, constructive resilience to the conditions of oppression. The expression constructive resilience has been used to describe the stance of the Baha'i community in Iran vis-a-vis their plight. The term was also used by the UN independent expert on minority issues in her 2013 report, which stated that religious minorities should consider strategies for constructive resilience in the face of persecution and project a positive role in their rehabilitation as equal in society where possible. The overarching concern for the Baha'i community is that the means of social change must be consistent with its ends. The community is trying to build vibrant society wherever they reside, trying to break down the barriers, structural and attitudinal, that have hindered the advancement of human civilization. Baha'is believe that it is not possible to build and sustain solidarity and unity through actions that require contention or assume, however subtly, that a conflict of interests underlies all human interactions. To give a concrete example, we can look at the Baha'i response to the intense persecution that followed the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Baha'is were fired from high positions they had attained. Thousands were reduced to poverty because of measures designed to suffocate the economic life of the Baha'i community. And thousands of Baha'i children were denied access to education. Baha'is began to mobilize creatively to ensure their survival and to continue to work for the betterment of their communities. And so I'll focus on one of these acts, namely the establishment of the Open University, also known as the Baha'i Institute for Higher Education, which was created in 1987 to provide for the educational needs of Baha'i youth after they were denied access to Iranian colleges and universities. For over 30 years, Iran has blocked the Baha'i community from accessing institutions of higher education. As a reminder again, the Baha'i community is the largest religious minority, the largest non-Muslim religious minority in Iran, and its members cannot go to university. Education is central to the flourishing and advancement of society and is held in high esteem in the Baha'i writings. From the earliest days of the Baha'i faith, the Baha'i community began to establish schools in Iran with a particular focus on the education of girls. Achieving 100% literacy among Baha'i women in comparison to approximately 40% within the population as a whole. So in the late 1980s, the Baha'i community made informal arrangements to begin offering university-level courses to Baha'i students, conducted in private through distance learning and/or in Baha'i homes and premises, using the volunteer services of Baha'i professors who had been fired from their jobs. And later, when we had the internet, Baha'i professors, or all professors, other professors too, non-Baha'i professors around the world have been assisting in this process. By mid-1998, the Institute had enrolled some 900 students, a faculty of more than 150 first-rate academics and instructors from around the world, and complete course offerings in 10 subject areas. It operated largely by correspondence, with small classes in private homes, but also had an infrastructure composed of various classrooms, laboratories, and libraries scattered throughout Iran. Yet its offerings were so well regarded that a handful of early graduates had managed to win admission to top-flight graduate schools overseas. This is despite not having been recognized in Iran, and they didn't have a degree to show, but their qualifications measured up. The Iranian government has made repeated attempts to stop this quiet, peaceful initiative. In 1998, 2001, 2003, and most recently in 2013, the government carried out a series of raids, arresting the institute's faculty and staff, and confiscating most of its equipment and records. These records were located in 500 different homes, and those homes were raided. Those who were arrested were asked to sign a document declaring that the Baha'i Institute for Higher Education had ceased to exist, and they would no longer cooperate with it. The detainees refused to sign any such declaration. So let me return to the question of social change. The question I've tried to address throughout my remarks has been that of who are the protagonists of constructive social change? History as well as present circumstances remind us that this is not the only prerogative of governments and legislative action, but of individuals who find themselves facing particular circumstances, who make a conscious decision, often at great personal risk, to demonstrate through their actions a path of justice. And in so doing, they disrupt, one by one, the foundations of conflict and war. And when we think of those protagonists of progressive social change, of those who participate in the ongoing construction of a more just social order, do we conceive of a role for the persecuted and the oppressed? Do they have agency or even responsibility? What role can victims themselves play in alleviating the ingrained societal prejudices against them? The approach of constructive resilience and non-adversarial action focused on continuing to strive for the betterment and the regeneration of one country provides a very different template for thinking about persecuted peoples and communities. It is very different from the approach generally adopted by human rights lawyers and defenders. Rather than asking exclusively what states should do to alleviate the situation, this approach, in addition to recognizing the pivotal role of the states, asks what such victims can do. There is a rejection of victimhood, and it shifts the discourse to one of empowerment. So what can these populations do? What is the scope of action available to them? By looking at the example of the Iranian Baha'i community's response to prolonged and consistent oppression in their native country, I want to suggest that the answer is a resounding yes, that to be a victim of such oppression does not equate with the absence of agency. That in the spirit of what the Baha'i community and the UN have referred to as constructive resilience is a response that neither succumbs to the oppression nor exhibits the characteristics of the oppressor. That through their non-adversarial but persistent and law-abiding actions, in a manner focused on contributing to the regeneration of their country, the Baha'i community of Iran has provided us with a powerful example of a pattern of resistance and constructive action in the face of grievous persecution. It is an example which, along with the others I have relayed in my remarks, helps us to see the many different kinds of power that are involved in the construction of peace. The power of principle, of solidarity, of selflessness, of human spirit, of pure and goodly deeds. I would like to conclude my remarks with an excerpt from a letter of the Universal House of Justice. Nothing can prevail against an idea whose time has come. The time has arrived for freedom of belief, for harmony between science and religion, faith and reason, for the advancement of women, for freedom from prejudice of every kind, for mutual respect between diverse peoples and nations, indeed, for the unity of the entire human race.